Union Black is a multi-format content series across YouTube and Google Arts and Culture, featuring a curated collection of videos, audio documentaries, podcasts, stories, and photographs celebrating Black British music artists, creatives, and scenes. Putting the voices of those who helped create these scenes and cultures at the forefront demonstrates the undeniable influence and impact of Black British music and culture here in the UK and beyond. This is Influenced, a documentary telling the story of how Black music culture travelled and evolved into the rich tapestry of art and artists we know and love now. "2023 marks 75 years since the Empire Windrush docked in Tilbury, Essex, with passengers from the Caribbean coming to the UK to begin their new lives and help rebuild the country following the Second World War. Although this wasn't her maiden voyage, the journey did mark a new era of mass immigration for those who lived in countries ruled by the British Empire. An ad in the Daily Gleaner, a Jamaican newspaper, on the 13th of April in 1948 offered passengers an opportunity to make the journey to the mother country, which the UK was known as in the Caribbean at the time.
The Empire Windrush brings to Britain 500 Jamaicans. Many are ex-servicemen who know England. They serve this country well. In Jamaica,
the ship carried 1,027 passengers, and they were among the first of many to arrive to the UK from Commonwealth countries between 1948 and 1971. They have since come to be known as the Windrush generation.
Our reporter asks them what they want to do.
Why have you come to England? To seek a job. And what sort of job do you want? Any type, so long as I get a good pay.
Some will go into industry, others into...
The arrival of the Empire Windrush was a seminal moment in the history of Britain's relationship with the Caribbean. Many of the ship's passengers had served in the British Armed Forces during the war, and as the Caribbean was part of the British Commonwealth, those who arrived were free to live and work in the UK as British citizens. Or so they thought. The 1971 Immigration Act marked the end of this migration, with Commonwealth citizens already living in the UK being granted indefinite leave to remain. But there was a problem. The UK government issued no paperwork confirming this.
Everything changed this week. In the space of 5 days, the Prime Minister was forced to apologise twice for the hurt caused to victims, while the Home Secretary said she was sorry for the appalling actions of her own department and issued a strong rebuke to her staff. Amber Rudd said she was concerned that the Home Office has become too concerned with policy and strategy and sometimes loses sight of the individual. How is it possible for the government to ignore for so long The Guardian's detailed reports of the tragic problems unleashed on passportless Windrush-era citizens by Theresa May's flagship immigration policy, the hostile environment for illegal migration, that she launched in 2013 as Home Secretary?
In recent times, we have come to associate Windrush with the word scandal. In the early 60s, as the Commonwealth countries were beginning to break free from their empire shackles and gain independence, the British government revoked the automatic citizenship once granted to those it had invited to help rebuild the country. Without paperwork to prove those who had settled here had indefinite leave to remain, which they were granted as part of the 1971 Immigration Act, and Theresa May's hostile environment in Britain regarding its approach to illegal immigration, many of the Windrush generation and their descendants became embattled with the Home Office. They were unable to prove they legally had the right to live here, in a country many of them had helped to rebuild. Although we are celebrating the movement of Black culture, it has sadly not been all open arms and opportunities, as many of those arriving in Britain back in the late 40s and early 50s found out the hard way. A group of Labour MPs, no less, wrote to the Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, calling for a halt in the influx of coloured people. There was also the infamous, and considered by some the most racist, election campaign in the West Midlands constituency of Smethwick, where Tory campaigners used slogans such as, "If you want an N for a neighbour, vote Labour." Neo-Nazis during this campaign also encouraged people not to vote, as a vote for Tory, Labour or Liberal is a vote for more blacks. It was a contentious time, to say the least. back to that first arrival. On a typically overcast British day in June, dressed in their Sunday best, the passengers, all men, arrived at Tilbury Docks. Amongst them was Trinidadian musician and Grandmaster of Calypso as he was known, Lord Kitchener. Pathé News was documenting the arrivals. As passengers departed, a reporter on board the ship asked Kitchener, looking dapper in his fedora and suit, to sing, having heard he was a Calypso artist.
Will you sing for us?
Right now.
Yes.
London is the place for me. London, this lovely city. You can go to France or America, India, Asia or Australia, but you must come back to London City. Well, believe me, I am speaking broad-mindedly. I am glad to know my mother country. I've been traveling the countries years ago, but this is the place I wanted to know, darling, London. This is the place for me.
Mykaell Riley is a reader in music at the University of Westminster, as well as the director of the Black Music Research Unit.
They're not dissimilar to any migrant community. You're leaving in order to better your life, the life of your family. You're hoping that this change in location, which is often traumatic, will fulfill your aspirations. But also, in the case of African Caribbeans, it was predicated on a promise. It was predicated on a historical relationship with the UK, with Britain. The Queen was seen as the mother, and the country was seen as the motherland. The reality was harshly different, but in terms of aspirations, you don't travel across the Atlantic to somewhere which is much colder for fun. One of the things that happens with any community is that you travel and you bring the key components of your culture with you. In the case of the Windrush generation, one of those components was the music. You traveled with your music. That was a mode of escapism that was really important. So the music came with them in the suitcases. Once they found the equipment and started playing the music, neighbors soon discovered a new frequency, a low-end frequency. Some were happy about it, others were not.
Calypso is one of the oldest genres of Caribbean music, originating around 300 years earlier in Trinidad. It was a music created by enslaved people to mock their owners and ruling classes. Upon arriving in the UK, the music was partly embraced, but also took on this storied role to demonstrate how black immigrants were being treated in the UK by their unwelcoming new neighbours. Kitchener's If You Were Brown highlighted racial inequality and documented his experiences as a black man in Britain. These are some of the lyrics. It's a shame, it's unfair, but what can you do? The colour of your skin makes it hard for you. If you're brown, they say you can stick around. If you're white, well, everything's all right. If your skin is dark, no use, you try. You got to suffer until you die.
Calypso was prominent across all the islands in the Caribbean. And Calypso, in many ways, foreground sound system culture. Calypso was also music that carried the message of the day or the message of the moment, where the DJ's actually curating what has recently happened on the street, in government, or a fight in a house or whatever. It was community commentary. And so you kept up to speed with what was happening. One of the interesting things about coming to the UK was the islands converged into one location. It's a period where connections were made that would not necessarily have been made otherwise, outside of this converging of, I think, the islands into one location, which is the UK.
In many ways, Calypso had the greatest impact on British culture at this time, as it seamlessly blended with more known black music genres like jazz and swing from the 20s and 30s. It was a genre that could be embraced in clubs and pubs. Specifically within the 1950s, Calypso and West Indian culture made huge inroads here in the UK with the British public. In response to racist violence in the summer of 1958, Trinidad-born activist and West Indian Gazette founder Claudia Jones started an annual indoor carnival. The inaugural carnival was broadcast on the BBC, live from St Pancras Town Hall. Jones's indoor carnival is credited by many as planting the seed that led to the Notting Hill Carnival as we know it, which was held outdoors for the first time in 1966 as a local event for children by Ronnie Laslett, a Londoner of Native American and Russian descent. In order to ease racial tensions following the violence of the 1950s, Laslett invited well-known pan player Russell Henderson, who was accompanied by his band, the Russ Henderson Steel Band. The band weaved its way through Portobello Road with a trail of locals spontaneously gathering to dance and celebrate. And with this, the Notting Hill Carnival was born. Lloyd Bradley is an author who writes mostly about black music. His books include Sounds Like London, 100 Years of Black Music in the Capital, and Bass Culture, When Reggae Was King.
Carnival then was like there was grumpy teenagers and children that were sort of dragged along because it was their parents' thing. It was, people from Trinidad and a few other islands celebrating who they were. Then what happened in the mid-70s, the sound systems took over. It was suddenly around sort of 74, 75, more and more sound systems started appearing on corners, setting up on corners in the area. This was great. This was exactly what we'd been looking for. Instead of walking round behind some wretched steel band, you could stand about with your hands in your pockets. You love that, right? And it was something we could actually relate to. And suddenly, the sound systems took over the carnival. That was what brought a new generation, a lot of UK-born kids. They could relate to the sound systems. They played their music, lovers rock reggae, roots reggae, funk and soul, It was all there for us. It was like going to a big sort of free open-air dance. And that brought a new generation into the carnival.
And a new generation of black British music lovers wasn't just coming through at Carnival. The British public was starting to take notice too.
If we look at the arrivals in the late 50s, it's a decade before we get to the 60s. And the early 60s, we collide with Jamaican independence in 62. And so we have a bit of a revolution happening on the big island, let's call it Jamaica, in terms of people getting excited about being independent of the UK. And lots of songs were written to celebrate this independence and also to celebrate just the success of surviving as an island up to that point. And ska was the music that came out of that. By 64, I think we have our first hit in the UK with My Boy Lollipop, but this is predicated on the period between the late 40s and the early 60s of white youth getting involved in this music. We have radio stations like Radio Caroline that at the time, pirate radio station, claimed to have a listenership of in excess of 20 million young people. Ska was part of that. Millie Small, My Boy Lollipop at the top of the charts, selling over 1 million records. It's important to point out at that point, the audience that made that record successful is the British public. It's crossed from a subgroup, the Mods and the first wave of skinheads, into the wider public. That's a powerful calling card for Jamaican popular music and evidence that it was making inroads into the British public.
Oh, and we're only just getting started. Although Calypso was the initial genre that was adopted once Empire Windrush docked on British shores, you may be wondering why Calypso isn't on all of your playlists now. The main reason is Jamaica and the arrival of ska. Ska, a genre that emerged in Jamaica in the late 1950s, was popularised in the UK by Jamaican musicians like Prince Buster, Laurel Aitken and Desmond Dekker, who arrived in the country during the 1960s. You know reggae? Of course you do. Everyone does. Well, reggae was born out of ska ska music is joyous. If you put some ska on the speakers in almost any social situation, everyone is up and moving with smiles on their faces. The upbeat rhythms, prominent horn sections, and lively melodies were quickly embraced by British audiences and helped to establish a thriving scene for it here in the UK. Its popularity paved the way for the emergence of reggae in the 1970s, which further cemented the influence of Caribbean music on British culture. Driven by deep but silky smooth bass lines and relaxed and steady drums, it was exactly what the UK needed. British reggae bands started to emerge through the 70s and 80s, including Steel Pulse, Black Slate, Aswad and Matumbi. Even Bob Marley himself lived in London at the time. As well as being a leading historian looking at Black British music culture, Mykaell Riley was a founding member of British reggae band Steel Pulse.
As a Black British reggae band, our first challenge was what was considered authentic reggae, which is that which came from Jamaica. And so we found it extremely challenging to find our own voice. As Black British musicians, you're not considered important or even worthy. If it was soul, you got the Americans. It's reggae, you've got Jamaicans. So if you're born in the UK and you're making music in any of these categories, authenticity came from outside the UK. So it was extremely difficult. And we're at a point where I think we're on the cusp of the height of authentic Jamaican reggae in the UK. We've got all the major bands being successful, but they're topped out by Bob Marley. But all of this is coming in like a juggernaut from Jamaica. So for us, we're trying to be the best possible Jamaican band from Birmingham.
As well as ska and reggae, lesser known is that the Windrush generation also had a significant impact on British jazz. Many Caribbean musicians who arrived in the UK during the 1950s and 1960s were highly skilled jazz musicians, and they quickly became an integral part of the British jazz scene. Musicians such as Joe Harriott, Harold McNair, and Desi Reese brought a new energy and style to British jazz, and their influence can still be heard in the work of contemporary British jazz musicians. Popular music also started to take notice. Many British pop musicians were influenced by the sounds of ska and reggae and incorporated these elements into their own music. The Beatles, for example, loved the genres and drew heavily from the ska beat to create Obla Dee, Obla Da in 1968. By the late 70s, other British pop musicians, such as The Specials, Madness and The Selector, drew directly from the ska scene to create their own unique sound, widely known as two-tone. Here's Pauline Black, lead singer of the legendary two-tone ska band The Selector.
Two-tone was the point. It kind of started around 78, and it started with The Specials. Jerry Dammers in particular, who was, he did animation at Coventry University here. It was Lancaster Polytechnic in those days, and I went there, but unfortunately I was doing biochemistry. I wasn't doing anything really interesting. And he came up with that whole idea for the two-tone man, which we call Walt Jabsco. But he also put together a band that he was honing that mixed up really kind of punk and rock, reggae initially, and then found that ska music, because it's more upbeat and it's a little faster, made it very, very danceable. And it wasn't like it was an original thought, but the Clash were there and they had mixed punk and reggae. But they'd just done it in a different way, and they gave a support slot to the Specials. And then the thing grew from there, and the Specials gave a support slot to the Selector, which was the band I was in, and that kind of grew. But we had different ways of mixing the sound with ska. We mixed it more with reggae and ska maybe, and the Specials mixed it more with rock.
Two-Tone Records was founded by Jerry Dammers of the band The Specials in 1979. He created the label to promote the music of the emerging ska scene. It was named two-tone after the distinctive black and white checkered pattern that became widely used in association with ska music. The black and white was a visual representation of the racial integration that two-tone stood for. It was exactly what the UK needed at the time. Racism was at dangerous levels, with organisations like the National Front spreading race hate across the country.
It was a bit depressing sometimes when some skinheads would turn up and start Mykaelling at the stage, but you knew you were talking to the people who actually mattered, i.e. whose minds might, ought to be changed. I mean, you were at the cutting edge of something when something like that happens. And there was a reason for the existence of the band.
The two-tone movement had a significant impact on the UK music scene and beyond, and it helped to popularise ska music around the world. Many of the bands associated with the two-tone scene went on to achieve mainstream success, and their influence can still be heard in the music of artists today.
I think the Selector embodied the Black British experience because we were part of a whole which included Black British music in terms of Black British reggae. That was beginning to come to the fore. You'd got, when we were coming up, you'd got bands like Steel Pulse, Misty and Roots, and Dennis Bovell was working in London. He was working with the Slits. He was embracing what was good about punk. And of course, you got Bob Marley coming over here. And that was the first time that, people had seen like a proper dread, as it were, and the I3s and, Judy Mowat and people like that. It was like, this was all incredible. The politics was in there. It was implicit in the music. When Marley did things like Trenchtown Rock or Exodus, that was where he was coming from. And there were plenty of kids over here who could identify with that kind of thing because you were feeling like a stranger in a strange land here. It was like you'd been to school with your white schoolmates and things like that, but you could still be called the N-word sort of on your way home or any of those kind of things. You knew you were not on a level playing field. And what two-tone arguably was trying to do was put music on a level playing field, like you were welcome in this place, black or white, let's make music together.
Many of those who came to the UK from the Caribbean were homesick for the music of their roots, and by the late 70s, it was clear an outlet was needed to get together and share. Sound systems were born. These sound systems would host parties and dances, and they became an important part of the social fabric of the Caribbean community in the UK.
In Jamaica, it was something that the ghetto people owned. In London, in the early 1950s, and I think the first sound system was probably a couple of years after Windrush, so we're talking about 52, 53, something like that, right? It was somewhere where black people could go and be themselves. When Jamaicans arrived in numbers, this would have been, again, post-Windrush now, right? They brought sound systems with them, and it's a bit like, was it Karl Marx said about the means of production or something, but they controlled the dances then. They could do their own dances. So they took over, essentially. Jamaican music took over at that point, because you could run a sound system in a hall, or you could run a sound system in your living room, or an empty house. So oddly, a lot of sound system dances used to happen in schools because the caretakers were Caribbean immigrants, and they'd open up on Saturday for a dance, and just make sure they'd swept up properly by Monday.
The reggae scene in the UK continued to grow, and as it did, a new sound began to emerge. This sound was slower and more soulful than traditional reggae, and it was characterised by its romantic lyrics and smooth melodies, moving away from reggae's often politicised lyrics. This new sound was dubbed Lovers Rock. One of the pioneers of Lovers Rock was a group called Brown Sugar, which was formed in London in 1976. Their debut single, I'm in Love with the Dreadlocks, was an instant hit, and it helped to establish Lovers Rock as a distinct genre of its own.
A characteristic of Black British music is its ability to reinvent itself every 3 or 4 years. One of the drivers for that is what it's pushing against, which is a need to be heard, a need to connect with its audience. In the mid-70s, we have a situation where we have more of a handshake, more of a toing and froing. Music's coming from the UK into Jamaica and back into the UK. And we also have a situation that up until this point has been by men, predominantly for men almost. The music is created by blokes. And yes, women are important, but it's a very blokey affair. Lovers Rock is a response to that, in as much as it recognized that to have a successful event, you needed women there. And it was an introduction of the female voice into the mix, but also the female narrative. And it was a softer narrative because up until then, we also had, as I said, this political, very activist stance. We had roots reggae dominating the sound system space. And it was a moment to slow down, chill out, find a woman, as it were. But it was also a moment where women were brought into the forefront and celebrated. It's the first British music response to what, up until that point, was a Jamaican experience in terms of all the new music was coming out of Jamaica. Lovers Rock is a pushback to that.
It became a cultural phenomenon within the Caribbean community in the UK, and it helped to bridge the gap between the Caribbean and British cultures. It also had an influence on British pop music, with artists such as UB40 and Culture Club incorporating elements of Lovers Rock into their own music.
Lovers Rock was really important in transforming a sound that was really rootsy, underground, sound system orientated to a more poppy chart type reggae. And that we could see reproduced in different acts over the years, where reggae became it got lighter. The message was much lighter as well. And it also made it, for some artists, for some producers, more accessible. For some radio stations, more palatable. Again, depending on which end of the industry you are, getting onto mainstream radio is a key objective. And I think with hits like Janet Kay's Silly Games, it confirms that British reggae can work, has an audience that is not just national, it is also international.
And it's fair to say that those roots have run deep. The influence of ska and Lovers Rock has echoed through generations of British musicians. Holly Cook is a reggae singer. She was also part of the final lineup of punk group The Slits before they disbanded in 2010.
That's when I really got into the Paragons, but then also listening to The Beat and The Specials and The Selector and Desmond Dekker. And I did kind of just really start from the beginning of the genre, and then it moved into Rocksteady and, discovering Marcia Griffiths and the female singers, and really then relating even more to the sound through the vocals. And then I remember my boyfriend's dad at the time was blasting out a Carol Thompson album, and I was like, oh my God, what is this? And then it was a tape, and on one side he had a Carol Thompson album, on the other side he had a Janet Kay album, and he lent it to me, and I was just like, this is the best thing I've ever heard. I really then just was so enamored by their vocals and the vibe of the Lovers thing. And then a friend of my dad's, who is a brilliant DJ, kind of clocked that I was really getting into all this stuff, so he made me a mixtape. And I just kind of, it's cool when your elders kind of see that you're feeling a way into the things that they're into, so they want to influence that as much as possible. At my shows, I think I've had anything from kids in their from the age of 10 to old guys in their mid-60s, it's really cool. There was one gig in Leeds where there was a whole group of beautiful queer kids, which I thought was a really cool thing to see at a reggae show. And then also, there's the whole sound system culture as well, and you go to Channel 1 nights and Abashanti nights, and there's just old rastas who have been there for decades, and then young kids from university going to Iration dances, and I think it just keeps happening. It's just perpetually just like young kids everywhere. All you have to do is go to like Outlook or Boomtown and they're all there. It's happening.
The influence of the Windrush generation on British music has been long-lasting and far-reaching. The vibrant sounds and rhythms of ska and reggae became an integral part of British music culture, and the contribution of Caribbean musicians to British pop continued to steer the music that came out of the UK. And it wouldn't be long before that music was recognised internationally either. The year is 1986. Sade Adu, known eponymously as Sade, is about to become the first black British artist to win a Grammy in the category of Best New Artist. The previous year, she had won Album of the Year at the Brits for Diamond Life, which included the now iconic hit, Smooth Operator. And now she was stateside, gaining recognition internationally for her music. And 4 years later, Maxi Priest would gain a Billboard #1 in the US with his single Close to You. The world was finally waking up to black British music in a big way, and it would only continue to do so over the years that followed. Britain's nightlife has always been a breeding ground for the freshest in new music. And while this was how music was discovered for those in the UK, it was also a way for our music to travel and reach new ears internationally. Mykaell Riley is a reader in music at the University of Westminster, as well as the director of the Black Music Research Unit.
Clubs are critical to the discovery. I mean, it's apart from the studio where you make the music, wherever that happens to be, the club is a space where the public gets to interface with that creative output. It's a space where they get to hear the music. It's the space in which the community comes together. It's also a space that has triggered new genres, not intentionally, but because the black community has been locked out. So in many instances, young writers, producers, creatives have created a genre because they're not permitted to go into a club space or clubs uptown or wherever that club space happens to be. So clubs have become created for the wrong reasons, but they're also the space in which creativity is shared.
Before Hoxton was a place where you could find an overpriced beer or a new build, in 1993, the iconic club Blue Note opened its doors. One night in particular, Metalhead's Sunday Sessions, launched in part by pioneering jungle and breakbeat DJ Goldie in 1995, quickly became a location for music lovers from around the world. It attracted celebrities from across the UK, including Bowie and Boy George, but also international legends like Bjork and Lauryn Hill. Music from breakbeats to drum and bass started being played at these club nights across all corners of London and became a key place for music lovers and DJs alike to discover tracks, not unlike the reggae and dub sound systems that came before them.
Clubs are critical to the discovery. I mean, it's apart from the studio where you make the music, wherever that happens to be, the club is a space where the public gets to interface with that creative output. It's a space where they get to hear the music. It's the space in which the community comes together.
And when you weren't at the club, there was another vital lifeline to share and discover the newest releases: radio. But when it came to the genres being explored by black British artists, you often had to look a little closer between the frequencies to find what you wanted. Back in the 60s, it was a struggle to find the diversity of genres on mainstream radio, which led to the emergence of pirate radio. Being streamed from secret locations all across the country, these stations helped an entire new sound to emerge.
There was a resistance to playing black British music, hence the growth of pirates. And the largest and most successful of them back then was Radio Caroline, which was playing everything from American rhythm and blues to bits of reggae, bits of soul. But they've got a large contingency of British fans. And I think any radio would be happy with the figures that Caroline had back in the 60s, which is in excess of 20 million.
Pirate radio station numbers continued to grow throughout the 70s. And in the 80s and 90s, it was the place to discover the sounds of the underground rave scene.
And what pirate radio for me is, it's almost like Che Guevara, man. It's rebellion. It's like pirate radio is letting you hear the sounds of your community, yeah? The sounds of your country.
Desmond George, widely known as Desi G, works in A&R and as an artist manager.
If you ain't got pirate, I don't think you have a Dynamite. I don't think you have a De La Soul. I don't think you have a Rap Attack. You know, you don't have them because anytime raw music or raw energy gets into the corporate world, it just starts getting shaped. It starts getting boxed, packaged, cool. But when you're looking at pirate radio, I'm like, pirate radio starts revolutions, man. You go in certain countries, man, that's the beginning of a revolution, you know? It overthrows governments. Pirate radio for me is like, it's the most important part of the journey to culture because it's the first time a young kid can listen to music and like, it's not tailored to them. Now, what I see pirate radio as is like, it's like the gatekeeper. It's like you're sitting there and it's like you have to go through that door if you're gonna do the rest. If you're not of the culture and coming through the culture, it doesn't matter how much money you got behind you, what you do, you're never gonna have that authentic touch to you. And that's what pirate radio gives. Like, if you think about every DJ that's come out of garage, every DJ that's come out of grime, every MC, every artist, they've all done pirate radio. Like, to go round it, like if the scene doesn't know you, you're not authenticated. It's just how it is.
One station that people turn to for music discovery is Rinse FM. But fans of the station now may not know that it began as a pirate radio station, launching over Carnival weekend in 1995. In fact, one of their founders, DJ Slimzy, was actually banned from every roof in Tower Hamlets in 2005 after being caught setting up a new satellite. But this just goes to show how Black British music genres were able to spread until they were accepted in the mainstream. Those involved in such iconic stations don't always have to hide anymore. Rinse was granted a community FM license in 2010, starting to broadcast legally in 2011. And they've since been able to expand internationally, with Rinse France launching in 2014.
As early as the 60s, it's quite evident that the British public have supported this music. This is not Black American music. This is Black British music. It's born out of the experience that happens in this location. If there is a silver lining, it is that the music has always had an audience here. It's difficult at times, but that audience has always been here. It's not always on mainstream national radio, hence a history of pirate radios for every single genre that you can name, but there's always been an audience.
And mainstream stations are embracing more genres than ever before, helping Black British artists to gain success across the country and internationally, while continuing to be themselves. Through the iconic UK clubbing scene and the ever-increasing media, the worldwide expansion was beginning. You're likely to have heard of the so-called British invasion of the mid-60s, the cultural phenomenon in which UK rock and pop acts, such as the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and The Who, gained significant success in the US charts. But by the mid to late 2000s, a third wave of British invasion was beginning. Black British artists, including Estelle, Floetry, Leona Lewis, and Teo Cruz, were enjoying huge success across the pond. The support of US artists was a huge help for certain iconic UK genres, making it big stateside. While grime was a true embracing of British culture, pushing against the need to Americanise and fit into a box, the world still took notice, thanks to artists such as Drake and Kanye West showing strong support for the genre. Twista was the first ever US rapper to feature on a grime song when he appeared on What We Do featuring Lethal Bizzle and Gappy Ranks. And later, Skepta collaborating with Puff Daddy on a grime remix of his track Hello, Good Morning.
I don't think you get to be big these days unless you got a bit of common sense in your head. Like when I look at Skepta's rise, because Skepta's the one for me. When I think about how many times Skepta was signed to a record label when he was young and he was doing all the pop records and all the corny stuff, he's gone through a couple developments before he's got to where he is now. And I'm like, when I look at him culturally, what he's doing, when I saw the Wizkid hit song with him, The Energy, Bad Energy, Stay Far Away, I'm like, oh my God, this is a moment. And look what's happened since then with the whole Afro beats in England and Europe, Rima, so I'm watching it all, Burna Boy, I'm watching it all, Thames, and I'm saying to myself, do you know what? I feel like England's on the verge of an artist running all the way through everything. And I think that right now, to blow, like I say, you have to be a bit more, there's got to be a bit more about you. You've got to be a bit more business-minded.
And this trend of collaboration with US artists has been given a boost in the age of social media. Take Sampha, who is known for his collaborations with some of the biggest artists around, from Kendrick Lamar to Drake to Solange. He won the Mercury Prize in 2017 for his album Process. And even more recently, Pink Pantheress, whose music is influenced by genres like two-step and drum and bass, has gained viral success with Boy's a Liar featuring US rapper Ice Spice. It goes without saying that the rise of social media and digital platforms, including YouTube and SoundCloud, have changed things massively. All of a sudden, success and reach could be found all by yourself, meaning more artists could break free from record labels and find authenticity and their own voices. The classic genres of R&B and soul continue to be reborn, with artists like Georgia Smith and Neo equally gaining success. On the YouTube channel Colours, Georgia Smith's session is currently the second most played, second only to Billie Eilish. Shanice Charway is the Artist Partnerships Manager of Black Music and Culture at YouTube.
Especially in the last 10 years, we've seen such a big shift. Once upon a time, there was like gatekeepers, meaning only certain artists can get played on the radio, featured in magazines, on TV. And now there's been such a big shift, which is super exciting. In the time I worked at YouTube, we've been able to work with so many different artists, especially Black artists, and they've been able to kind of create their own DNA online without having to rely on radio or everything else. They've kind of been able to do it themselves, which is great. And I think with YouTube as well, just because of like the likes of SBTV, Mixtape Madness, Link Up, GRM, they've allowed Black artists to kind of be able to be at the forefront of these things, especially with freestyle. So it's changed a lot. Like they're now their own gatekeepers, which is really exciting.
And with social media platform TikTok bursting to the front of cultural consciousness during the start of the global pandemic, artists had more of a platform than ever before to grow their audience and reach. For example, the huge TikTok trend Don't Rush Challenge saw creators from all around the world getting ready to the Young T and Bugsy featuring Heady One track, Don't Rush. Or Drea Mack, who went viral on TikTok with her freestyle on the track Own Brand featuring Felix the First. Although she was already popular in her own right, the song, along with the coordinated dance routine created by former professional dancer Drea herself, was a catapult. It was nominated for a MOBO, and Drea was even invited out on stage for SZA's headline slot at Wireless Festival to perform with her. And other Black British artists have used other ways of gaining success internationally. Labyrinth, while being known in the UK for his huge hits such as Pass Out with Tiny Temper and Frisky, gained huge international acclaim after composing the score for HBO drama series Euphoria. The series gave him multiple Emmy nominations and an Emmy win for the single All of Us. The rise of social media has allowed Black British music to travel in new ways, but the potential has always been there. Through residencies, the club scene, and word of mouth, our music has gone global, influencing new generations both here and abroad. There's a uniqueness about Black British music, the way genres are woven together, ever evolving to create some of the newest and most exciting sounds. One genre that influenced the British music scene in a huge way was the rise of house music, slowly evolving on the dance floors of some of Chicago's queer clubs, including The Warehouse. Primarily focusing on R&B and disco, when combined with drum machines, it spawned the early iterations of Chicago house music. And then, in 1986, legendary Chicago DJ Steve Silk Hurley released Jack Your Body. This became the UK's first ever house music chart topper. Something was beginning to happen. Here in the UK, a scene was being born.
Right, so remember, you had Time FM and Kiss FM. They're the first two that I remember. Kiss went on to become legal. Now, when I was young, you used to have to listen to the radio to know where there was going to be a rave. And then you'd go to the cabman and you'd all put 20 quid in, because sometimes you're going to Milton Keynes. And he'd get you there, and you'd be following, like, go to a petrol station, it'd be like, yeah, M25 petrol station on IS. You get there, someone pops out from the back, yeah, he raves up there and all of that. So yes, I was involved, but totally as a young, like a fan, not behind the scenes,
Chicago producers began experimenting with deeper bass lines and new synthesizers, creating what became known in the UK as acid house. Jack Your Body had lit a match, and the following music journey was the catalyst for some of the UK's most iconic music genres. Acid house raves began springing up all over the UK. At the time, the UK was struggling under ex-Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and nightlife was in a dire state. And so music lovers and party-goers turned to illegal events to get their fill. Raves in abandoned warehouses, fields, under motorway bridges, anywhere where you could fit a generator and a couple hundred people would do. Invitations travelled by word of mouth. Many of the events had passwords or burner phone numbers to share location details, and organisers had to be quick on their feet to avoid arrest. But they were fighting an intense battle with the police and government. Communities of people coming together, often under the influence of drugs, was not something that fit into the narrative of Thatcher's Conservative Britain. And so, by 1989, the Pay Party Unit was put in place, tapping phones, monitoring pirate radio, and keeping a database of organisers and partygoers' details and number plates. Mykaell Riley is a reader in music at the University of Westminster, as well as the director of the Black Music Research Unit.
The state has always sought to control youth. And so it really doesn't matter whether there's a rave culture in the 90s or sound system culture in the 70s or grime in the 2000s. There is a pushback from the state that has been constant. And at that point in time, it's no different. It's about controlling, I think, young people and their engagement with music. And there's a handover between sound system and rave culture that is sometimes overlooked because I would argue that sound system is the godfather of rave culture, but it carries the baggage of that police relationship.
And in 1994, the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act was passed, a response to the rise in illegal raves. An act which gave the police the power to shut down events featuring any music with the so-called succession of repetitive beats. This use of police power to squash a particular type of music is reminiscent of the more recent Form 696. This Met Police Risk Assessment Form from 2007 required promoters of events to provide names, addresses, phone numbers of performers, as well as describing the style of music, the target audience, and the details of the ethnic groups more likely to attend.
Although the policy, Form 696, should have targeted all musicians, it disproportionately was applied to black musicians. And because of the time period we're talking about grime.
Grime artists such as Giggs and MCP Money claimed that their shows had been pulled last minute as a result of the form.
Police could approach a young person, ask for their mobile phone, ask for their contact details, and tell them that they're not going to perform at a particular venue. They could then pursue the venue, the promoter, the manager, and also threaten them with not renewing their license or penalties.
While the requirement to give details of ethnic groups attending was taken out in 2008, it wasn't until 2017 that this clearly discriminatory form was entirely discontinued, thanks in part to Mykaell and a rather surprising collaborator.
I wanted to challenge the police. I was surprised. I actually got support from, of all people, Matt Hancock. Matt Hancock took it in, announced it, and said, we support challenging the police. We've taken the big data, so this is the first big data report on grime artists. And it highlighted that these were not criminals, these were entrepreneurs who had circumvented the music industry, generated real money, their own money, it's all legit, and that this persecution was unjust, took it into the mayor's office, so post House of Commons announcement, took it into the mayor's office, and a policy that had been around for like 15 years or so was removed in 3 weeks. So we actually got rid of Form 696. So that was a success story.
But back in the 90s, music lovers weren't letting the police crackdown stop them. While the fight to party was raging on, the music scene was evolving faster than ever. Spinning off from the rave scene, one of the UK's most essential genres began to rise: jungle. A form of drum and bass, it was a new sound. Darker and perhaps grittier than the music that tended to play at UK illegal raves and parties, it was symptomatic of the post-Thatcherite Britain of the early 90s. Many disenfranchised young people needed somewhere for their feelings to be expressed, and jungle became that place. It was at this time that DJs including Shy FX and Goldie rose to prominence. Supported largely by the pirate radio stations, jungle started to be recognised more in the mainstream, with BBC Radio 1 giving jungle its own weekly show, One in the Jungle, in 1995. While some major labels were giving deals to jungle artists such as a guy called Gerald and DJ Ron, the scene was still keen to preserve the underground in its ethos and sound, with plenty of smaller record labels and underground clubs. Songs like General Levy's Incredible lit up dance floors across the country, and fast forward 30 years, you can stick that song on now at a party and you still get the same reaction. Feet moving fast, gun fingers in the air. Also rising up in the 90s was garage, known as UKG, which was evolving from disco, soul and funk music coming out of the US in the early 80s. It was a unique sound, fast, complex drum patterns, deep bass, and incorporating elements of jungle, R&B, and hip-hop. Garage, like jungle, came into its own on the pirate radio stations, and it went on to be the basis for more of our iconic musicians today, from Mystique to Miss Dynamite. It had a vibrant club scene, with venues like The Fridge and Ministry of Sound hugely helping the development of the genre. UKG lent heavily on MCs and DJs, being influenced greatly by Jamaican sound system culture. These genres have continued to influence those who came after, including DJ Locksmith from drum and bass group Rudimental.
We've had so many influences growing up. One of the biggest influences we've had is sort of like the London underground scene, or even the UK underground scene, if you like. Anything from old school garage to house to drum and bass to jungle, you know. We listened to like the Goldies of the world and the Ronnie Sizes of the world, and we wanted to sort of adapt it and see how we can make it our own.
Two-step was a genre very similar to UK garage, but with more of a focus on vocals and slightly fewer musical elements. The collaboration between two-step producers Artful Dodger and Craig David reached number 2 in the UK singles chart, with of course the iconic track Rewind. And 2001 saw the release of the huge number 1 hit Do You Really Like It from DJ Pied Piper and the Masters of Ceremonies. Two-step hasn't just been confined to the UK though, with North American artist The Weeknd being influenced by the genre and utilising two-step sounds on his track Rocking from 2016. UK music is ever evolving and fast. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, a new sound was beginning to rise through the ranks. Blending UK garage, dancehall and hip-hop, grime was born. So Solid Crew's 21 Seconds from 2001 is now often acknowledged as one of the precursors of the grime genre, which was officially thrown into the spotlight when Dizzy Rascal won the Mercury Prize in 2003 for his album Boy in the Corner. But before its official recognition by the music establishment, grime was another genre that was platformed by the pirate stations, with new producers and MCs experimenting with new sounds. In 2002, the now legendary compilation album Run the Road was released, featuring some of the biggest names in grime at the time, including Jammer and Kano.
I'd be reluctant to say grime is a political movement any more than reggae was a political movement, or even jungle for that matter, or two-step, or any of the black music genres. They've been politicized, which is a very different thing. It's popular music made by youth. Young kids have always commented on the government What's challenging is if you then have a chart hit with a song that is speaking about those things, because you then have an audience that's with you that on occasions can vote, and that's power.
And grime has become a vehicle for speaking truth to power, even dabbling into politics with the movement Grime for Corbyn, which saw artists attempting to get young people to register to vote in 2017. From the mid-2010s, the genre of Afro swing was on the rise, a name coined by rapper Kojo Funds, with artists mixing Black British genres like hip-hop and rap with the sounds of their own heritage, ranging from Afrobeats to dancehall.
I think the handshake between African Caribbeans and West Africans happened maybe a decade ago, and we're now beginning to see the fruits of that, where we have a new generation of musicians that grown up on the influence of the Windrush musicians that are finding a new voice. It's no longer absolutely about the Caribbean, it's now about West Africa. And so in terms of a trajectory or a flow, it's kind of Black to Africa, which is really kind of positive. But also the fact that within Afro beats, and it's lots of different musical formats there, there's a wake-up call from America, where America now is recognizing its Africanness, if you like, with artists like Burna Boy finding its way into the charts, and even Little Simz, a nod to reggae, a nod to Afrobeat, a nod to pop, and so on. We're on the cusp of a new golden age in terms of Black British music that speaks directly to Africa, but also recognizes its Britishness and is still anchored to a Caribbean reference, a reggae legacy.
J Hus has been credited as one of the forefront pioneers of the Afro swing genre, originally calling the sound trapro beats to signify the unique mix of Afrobeat and trap influences. In 2014, Hus appeared on GRM Daily with a freestyle, racking up millions of views since. And the support of other digital platforms continued to help the genre grow, pushing it out to an ever-increasing international audience. He went on to win Best British Male Solo Artist at the Brit Awards in 2021. In 2018, Afro swing artists such as Weston, Young Bane, and Notes appeared at South by Southwest Festival in Texas. It was the first time the genre had ever been represented at the festival.
I think Afro swing is something super exciting. Amapiano. There's a lot more cultural relevant events for these certain genres now. So there's an event called Daggy Sounds that really champion Amapiano, which obviously started from South Africa, but we're seeing it happen here. Same with Afro beats, Afro swing. So like the likes of like NSG, J Hus are super key and important to these genres. I think those are the two that I think people are going to slowly be like, oh, this is super exciting. I want to know more about it. But like with all Black music, it's always elevating and changing. So I'm sure there'll be something else that no one's even thought about. I've seen a couple of clips on shorts of people mixing dancehall and Afro beats. So that could be something that might be taken off.
While Black British artists have enjoyed huge success in genres like rap, R&B, and grime, these artists continue to pave the way in genres across the board, refusing to be put into a box by the industry and fans alike.
So I think for the first time with the likes of Nova Twins, we've seen a Black girl rock band, which is amazing. And the support they've been able to get is just makes me so happy, because I think sometimes Black artists get put in a box that they need to only do rap or hip hop. But we're seeing the likes of like Bree Runway doing pop flow, bringing R&B back. And we've had the likes of Digga D, Central C, Dave, Stormzy, all coming through from like different genres. They're everywhere. And it's not like I have to make rap music for me to be in the charts. We're seeing that's completely changing, which is great.
Indie musicians like Arlo Parks, rock musicians like Nova Twins, and indie folk artists like Mykaell Kiwanuka continue to show that Black British music is not just one thing. Artists are defying expectations and defining genres, from electronic to indie to pop to neo-jazz.
I would say that Black British music is popular music, end of. It underpins popular music. And where it's not upfront, it's a key catalyst in popular music and the culture that comes out of that.
What I'd love to see next is more of connections between different genres, so people experiment a little bit more. I think that would just take it to another level. I feel like the artists now that are in the charts and that are pushing the culture, music forward are now really established. So now it's like taking the risk and seeing what else we can do to show how amazing these sounds are. Especially like back in the day, I think a lot of sounds were always being mixed. So I think I would love to see more of that and just continue to champion each other and understand that like we don't have to always be in this competitive spirit. It can definitely be like, what do we want to do next? How do we push Black music forward and change it for the next generation of people to see the exciting stuff that we've done?
The future is bright. Let's continue to celebrate it. Union Black is celebrating Black British music and the artists and creators who formed it. YouTube and Google Arts and Culture together are highlighting the impact Black British music and culture has had on the UK and beyond. To discover more stories from Union Black, go to Google Arts and Culture at goo.gle/Union Black. Share and let us know your thoughts using the hashtag Union Black.